Hi, everybody. Today we're going to be talking about loss of control in flight human factors, specifically resilience in crisis. Topics will span from cognitive load to startle surprise to stress management. And we're going to start the topics by talking about what we see in practical upset prevention recovery training, then bringing in our expert to talk about the psychophysiological aspects behind it. Stay tuned. Welcome back, everybody. It's great to have you here again. My name is Paul BJ Ransbury. I'm a master instructor, former military fighter pilot and airline pilot. But most importantly, I'm the CEO of Aviation Performance Solutions, where we have 3 decades specializing in upset prevention and recovery training. I am truly honored today to be welcoming Dr. Janeen Kochan. Janeen has a PhD in applied experimental and human factor psychology. She has a Master of Science in Industrial and Systems Engineering, but most importantly, to bring it all into perspective, she's a former airline captain and human factors instructor, and believe it or not, has an A&P with inspection authority. She's an instructor, FAA designated pilot examiner, and if that isn't enough, she has over 30,000 hours of flight time. She does human factors research for the FAA, NASA, and other organizations. She's currently also an adjunct professor at Embry-Riddle teaching system engineering and human factors for graduate courses. She was also, again related to today's conversation, an instructor at CalSpan in upset prevention and recovery training in the Lear 31. I've known Janeen for over 15 years. Together, we've worked on the ICAO manual on upset prevention and recovery training and other projects, and even on the MBAA safety committee together. She's a great lady. She's humble, and I consider her a great friend. And with me today as well is Captain Clark McNeese. Otter, welcome. I know you're a last-minute addition. Otter's been with us for nearly 20 years now, leaving Southwest Airlines captain on the 737, and has been with us and is now our Executive Vice President of Standards and Compliance at APS, former military pilot, fighter pilot, F-18 pilot. Gosh, I think you flew an airplane before you drove a car, right, Otter? Do you want to just clean up what I said there about you, and then we'll get to Janeen?
Yeah, I did. It started at 14 with sailplanes and on to power planes at 16 after that. I know, similar to Janeen, flying little airplanes has got to be one of my most favorite things to do.
So, Janeen, we talked the other day, and I'll always tell people you have 3 airplanes in your hangar, but you said, no, you used to have 8, and now you're down to only 3 airplanes. Is that right in your backyard?
That is correct. Yes, we tend to buy and sell them, or build and sell them. And so currently we're just down to 3 really great airplanes. At RV7, we just finished building a Super Decathlon and a Legend Cub on amphibs, so we can splash around the lovely lakes here in Central Florida.
Awesome. That is great. Well, let's jump right into it here, guys. Anything else, Otter, you want to add?
No. Yeah, I'm looking forward to having Janeen. It's great.
All right. So today we'll do a quick introduction as to why loss of control is such an issue and why this event today is so important, especially on the human factor side of it. So the challenges we're going to talk about range from cognitive load and situational awareness, startle and surprise response, stress and anxiety management. And then out of the critical UPRT integration areas, we're going to be talking about what we see in UPRT, the mental conditioning that goes on, and a lot of the emotional regulation for pilots to be effective in crisis. And almost secondary to that is the motor skills and the psychomotor control. I often tell people the very easiest thing to do when you're teaching upset training is what to do and how to do it. Actually having the ability to access those skills in a real world crisis is really the tough part, which is the human factors component we're going to be talking about today. perceptual motor mismatch, decision-making under pressure, and of course that can manifest in CRM or SRM, depending on whether you're operating as a crew or single pilot. And then we're going to wrap up today on UPRT mastery features, which is going to be the main topic at our next session, I believe, coming up a week this coming Friday, so after Christmas. So from an introduction standpoint, Otter, maybe you can help me with this. Since loss of control is really the leading cause of fatal accidents in aviation, we would consider it really to be a risk associated with a number of hazards. And in fact, the Airplane Upset Recovery Training Aid lists nearly 20 of those hazards that have an outcome or a risk of loss of control. And I think it's because of the complexity and how it's not such a simple solution of just eliminating complacency or distraction or other areas that would seem like that would be the solution. It's more complex than that. So do you want to maybe address that a little bit, Otter, as you're looking at the remaining bullets there in the introduction as to why this is such an important topic for pilots? And I think really decision makers understanding this is not a one and done type of a training process.
Yeah, no, I agree. I like one of the quotes that you like to say is, the more complex the system, the more complexly they fail, right? And we clearly are seeing that even with flight envelope protected aircraft that are coming out, and catching pilots, in flight conditions completely off guard, and likely with low situational awareness about the status of their airplane, and that can affect their organization in how they handle the airplane. And so human factors is really the main issue that we have to address in upset prevention and recovery training.
It really is. And it's interesting on that last bullet under human factors, or second last one, can interfere with optimal performance. It can eliminate performance altogether. People get incapacitated or just guessing what to do. That fight or flight response is that it really is a massive problem. It's just not a little bit different. It's a lot different. So with that, we're going to jump into you, Janeen, with Captain Janeen Kochan. And so, Janeen, anything you want to do to introduce your section? I know Otter and I are going to kind of talk about what we see in a typical training process over a few days. What are your maybe opening thoughts as we jump into this section of your discussion?
Well, BJ, that's a good question. And thank you so much for being on stage again with you and Otter. It's always a great pleasure. And so I think my part today, I'm going to stay primarily on the academic side. And as we go along, I'm going to offer some exact words, if you will, from publications, academic publications, research studies that support with research what we've been saying, again, to bring to everyone's attention that we talk about these words, we talk about these concepts, and it's very rarely do we bring out and here's the scientific basis for why that is. So that's where I'm coming from today. And as usual, I just want to share as much as I can in our time allowed.
Awesome. That's great. So we're going to spend most of our time here today. We do want to make sure we get to questions. So folks, if you do have any questions, please get those in queue. Even post them right now. We have Carrie with us in the back room. She's going to flag those for us to address at the end. We will be saving those questions to the end, but please, at any point, put them in. They won't get lost. We will see them. Okay. So what we have here, I'm just going to talk to it, and Otter, you can jump in as needed. We're kind of setting the stage as to what we see after nearly 30 years of delivering upset prevention and recovery training. And so what this graph represents, or the title we like to call it, is the Upset Training Cognitive and Psychomotor Learning Process. It really is a whole lot more to it than just getting people into an airplane and kind of giving them a few tools to use. It really is a psychological process. In fact, I often talk about the instructors are more psychologists, really, especially in the first couple of flights, than they are even instructors. But on the bottom side, you can see it says no UPRT is essentially where have we seen through the investigations we've done. And Janeen was part of that way back in, gosh, I think 2007, 2008. And then we've had follow-on looks at it previously. What is the competency of a pilot in a startling, surprising event just out of the gate. We did that with 135 pilots. We have a really good idea where that is. And then what's the benefit of one UPRT program, 2, 3, 4, and then an integrated, more robust program? That's the scale on the bottom. Then on the left is an assessment of competency. And it's just a guide by which you can have a look at what the overall effectiveness is as we go through training. And then on the right, you can see the different color lines. What do we see after initial training? And then when we bring these people back after a year, 2 years, 3 years, 5 years, what are we seeing based on their success or lack thereof? And so we've had folks go through our program 5, 8, 9, 10. In fact, I think 10 times for Mark Gaston with the military. So we've had a chance to see this process in and out, even the same people coming back over and over. Okay, so what we find is an initial testing with that 135 pilot group where we just gave people 2 hours of ground training on what to do and how to do it, getting them up in an airplane, having them get familiarization, handling, very comfortable with the airplane, and not even looking for any particular type of a method or strategy to be able to effectively just get the airplane back into the heart of the envelope without overstressing it or just fundamentally split-S-ing into the ground. And what we found was with no UPRT, the success was between about 20 and 40% or 30%. So it really is just recovering by accident is what it comes down to. It's kind of what ends up happening. Now, after one flight, you can see that there's actually a pretty significant climb there. And it really doesn't come so much from training, but more of an awareness of the threat that it's real and something they need to take seriously. Now, this isn't a 3-day program. So this is what we see after the first session of training. The no UPRT is before training begins. And so that's day 1. And on day 2, we now get to the first flight of the second day, which is the second flight of the program. And you would think that the trajectory of training would look like that green dotted line, but that's not at all what happens. So in that first one, we're seeing benefit from an increased awareness and a certain level of habituation. And in the next one, though, there's a pretty strong regression. We see that almost without exception is the pilots going through training on that first flight of the second day are almost worse off than they were when they showed up. And it's kind of a phenomenon called sensitization. It's essentially, yeah, what I was afraid of, I really should have been. Now I'm even more afraid now. And it's kind of the outcome. And the worst thing that you can do as a UPRT provider, in our judgment, is a 2-flight program. It's better. It's worse than not doing anything. And on that second flight of the third day, we now see the gradient picking up again, as you would expect. And that's where some extinction comes in. We'll talk about that a little bit later here in our conversation. Then as we start getting into the fourth flight, this is really where the overlearning starts happening. So kind of habituation, you start getting used to things. Sensitization, as I talked about. Extinction is kind of where we can retire some of our fears if they're replaced with kind of new overarching experience. But overlearning is really where the resilient skill sets lie. We don't feel that folks even have a life-saving skill set until after the fourth flight and 3 days. It's not just 4 flights in a day, 4 flights in 2 days. As I told Janeen before the event, there's really a benefit of having a couple sleeps. But you can see that the skills really atrophy relatively quickly. After a year, they're relatively strong. 2 years, they've dropped substantially. And then as you start getting into the 5-year point, it's better than if they didn't come, but not a whole lot. Then the more integrated and comprehensive the training, the more embedded the skills are. And we really use that to do, a transfer of a skill where we start using simulation and virtual reality and jet airplanes and different aspects to make the program even more embedded for them. So, Otter, before we go to Janeen on this, you live this every single day. Is there anything you'd like to comment on here just before we jump into the technical side of it? This is more of the practical provider side that we see as a UPRT delivery organization.
Yeah, I'll just say, we as a business tried to figure out a way to shorten training as much as possible. We would love to be able to take pilots in for a day and give them robust, ingrained, embedded, recallable skills in one day, but we can't do that. It's not possible from a human factor standpoint. And we saw that, yes, pilots do need to have a minimum of 4 flights. Even 3 is not sufficient to maximize that that competency and even a confident competence there. And you might think, well, if you have a 3-flight graduate, compare him to a 4-flight graduate, you might think that 4-flight graduate is, say, only 25% better. But in fact, he's like 10 times better. He literally is. There's something about sleeping on it that extra night, and that 4th flight, something magical comes together. I know Janeen can even speak to really well, and how it all, that the competence and confidence all just comes together and gels, and they are very robust after 4 flights compared to a 3-flight graduate.
So Janeen, this is kind of our, anecdotal, what we see as a training provider. And I think the part where people get surprised by 2 areas. Number one, the regression on flight 2, and then that massive increase on the 3rd day between the 3rd and the 4th flight. It's anything you want to comment on here? I mean, we never talked about this in advance. Did you want to chat about this at all in any way before we jump into your slides?
I think the way you put the terms such as sensitization, in other words, wow, this really is something that that I was fearful of, and now I know I really should have been. I think you have tagged that properly in that decline. And then I think what is interesting to me are those over the years, how the performance decreases somewhat, but because the question becomes, how often should we conduct recurrent training? And I thought about whether to confess or not, but I don't see any 10-year line in there. So I guess I'll be coming out to see you guys.
For sure. Well, we find that flight departments kind of self-select about every 2 to 3 years. We recommend every year because I think that's the ethical thing to do. But it's one of those things, and I always say this whenever we talk about it, and Otter can remind me if I get it wrong, but that same fellow, Mark Gaston from the military that came, less of the military, then with L3 and then into his next job, I remember asking Mark, saying, so Mark, this is not time number 9. Are you learning more and more? And he said, no, I'm forgetting less and less. And so I think it's a really interesting perspective that he had on that. That was really an epiphany for me. And so before we jump in, I want to just mention this quote, Janeen, that seems very relevant to us because it really is about that intensity of training and what we're talking about. We made a decision years ago. Are we going to give training to people where they feel like they're better in a 1 or 2 day program and a couple of flights, or we want to actually save the life? So we don't offer programs less than a 4-session program over 3 days. And it's just what we see is what's required. So General George S. Patton Jr. said, he who sweats more in training bleeds less in battle. And that's really about the overlearning and preparation. Otter, anything to add to that before we jump into Janeen's slide?
No, that's spot on.
Okay, Janeen, you have this really cool chart here. Do you want to talk us through this?
I do. I'm going to back up first and define a couple terms that we all talk about all the time. And the first thing is, and it's in the title of our program, are human factors. And just so that we understand what we're talking about, they're very, very broad. And, I've coined it the psychological, physiological, social, cultural, and environmental influences on human performance. So there are many aspects of these quote unquote human factors. And then in just a little bit, we'll say, well, how does that play into that term resilience? It's a very often used term, again, with needing to be defined in our context. What are we talking about? What is resilience? So to get there, I'll start with the simple part of this diagram. And the point of this slide is to make sure we understand that there are many, many different types, sizes, shapes, names of unexpected events or events that trigger a loss of control in flight. And we've talked about that. We've studied it. We know the environmental conditions that can contribute and distractions. And we've talked about those terms, but knowing that we can't just train for one event, and which is what generally happens in the training environment, such as at the U.S. airline procedures is, special purpose operational training, where we're going to train you how to respond to a wind shear. We're going to train you how to respond to a CFIT. We're going to respond to a wake turbulence. And those are specific events, but not really focusing on the overall, how do we respond to an unexpected event, which leads me to getting to talk about the first quote, if you will, and looking at all of these different types of events. So we have a model. I'll go ahead and BJ, if you'll go ahead and bring the model up. I'm not going to go over this whole model. This is a process model of surprise, and perhaps you're surprised to see it here in an aviation training talk. And it is a schematic that is somewhat like the DC-8 electrical system, I think, to me, is what it looks like. But the point is here is we make decisions, we process information in a normal capacity as we go along. If we are presented with an unexpected event, something that may be novel, we haven't seen before, or slightly different than we have seen in the past, we're going to take in that information. We have to process the cues that are available given this situation. And we go through this process. And what I'm going to focus on in this particular schematic are items that can be addressed, human factors deficiencies that can be addressed by UPRT. So the first place we're going to look is when we process this information, we're going to look and say, I'm going to do an appraisal of this unexpected event. And I'm going to determine whether it's something I've seen before and I think I can handle, or is it completely different? And that how humans look at events was studied, and this is the appraisal of unexpectedness. And a study that we conducted, we looked at the concept of stress, because we're going to come back to that concept over and over again here for the next little bit. And so for this particular study, we used a concept of stress based on what is known as the cognitive appraisal model, for which there is considerable research support. That's Lazarus and Folkman, believe it or not, 1984. The model proposes that when individuals encounter challenging situations, they orient both their cognitive and physiological resources to deal with the situation. Physiological responses such as increased heart rate and force, faster breathing, and restriction of peripheral blood flow prepare the body for fight or flight. Cognitively, the individual focuses attention to the challenging situation, mentally preparing for whatever tasks may be required. Up to this point, the individual's resources are mobilized to deal with the challenge, but we choose not to call this stress because the individual can manage the situation effectively and performance may actually improve. However, if the situation becomes threatening physically or socially, and the individual is uncertain of his or her ability to manage the threat, anxiety arises. This anxiety is maladaptive because it disrupts the individual's ability to manage the threatening situation, particularly by degrading attention and working memory, both of which are crucial for managing challenging situations effectively. So if we go, now we're looking at this situation. If it's beyond a threshold, and I don't have a pointer, but it's beyond our discrepancy, it's greater than our threshold in the blue, then we have the interruption of ongoing processes down there in pink, and we enter a state of surprise. Okay. So this is, and comes right up to cognitive load as well, BJ. But this is where we want to focus on the risk assessment that pilots make on every time an event is encountered. And the blue squares that I've highlighted there are areas that UPRT directly improves. That threshold of what is perceived as unexpected is raised to a point where it's, by the time you're done with your training and stay current with it, it's, oh, well, there's another situation, but I don't have to know exactly. It's not a wake turbulence, it's not a wind shear, but I know how to respond to this. And then if we go down to where we're looking at, our action selection and execution gets better. If we go to the right on self-efficacy, this is another area that is greatly enhanced, as Otter said, confidence, which is reflected in the academic term, self-efficacy, how well do I think I can do, is greatly enhanced by UPRT. So just in this DC8 electrical schematic I have here, we have areas that we can point to from academic research that UPRT improves. So let's look at a couple of specific examples. So if you'll go to the next slide, BJ, please.
Yeah.
So now we have cognitive load. And we have challenges of cognitive loads, the thinking skills, right? And if we look at what creates a high cognitive load, there's a couple things we want to talk about in today's world. But in general, I will share with you a study again that we conducted.
And while you're looking that up there, Janeen, we do have that video that we showed of the student.
Oh, yes.
I don't know if you wanted to do that before or after,
Yes.
or what your preference was.
Yes, let's go ahead and take a look, an example of cognitive load, and then we can explain what we're seeing.
Okay, and Otter, you might want to talk to this as well, because we showed this before with the permission of the student, of course. You're not going to be able to tell who he is, but you'll be able to see his response. Let's go ahead and show that. Here we go.
All right, let's try one more, all right? Yeah. Gotta push. And then push and then roll. Just follow.
Was I not pushing on the last one?
You pushed better, but then you didn't roll all the way back. You want your wings to be back with your lift vector pointed into the blue after you roll.
Okay.
All right, so roll it back, roll it out. All right, here we go. Let's go again.
Yeah.
All right, power's coming back.
So right wing low?
Right wing low, left rudder, or either way, it doesn't matter. Hold it right there. That's good setup. Nice job. Gonna roll to the left away from the ball. Hold it. Hold it.
Here we go. Push.
Kick that rudder out.
Roll.
Stay upright. I have control. I have control.
I'm sorry.
Otter, anything you want to add to that before Janeen jumps in? I know we've seen that a few times.
Yeah, no, just for the audience so they understand that was a cross-controlled stall that he was working on. It was very beginning, part of the second flight, and cross-control stalls, full cross-control stalls, not just recovering at the warning, but actually recovering at the full stalls. Very challenging for most pilots, and in his case, you can see he had a precondition, like embedded fear already there that he was trying to overcome. Good news was he did get over it, and he did end up doing well by the end of the program. But it was a challenge for him.
And versions of that experience are common. It's not uncommon. This isn't unique. It's people go through that process of having to let their guard down, understanding this is a new area of training and skills and competencies, and they're trying to develop that been there, seen that value so that they have the ability and the kind of the mental resilience, so to speak, to be able to still be effective in that type of a situation. Janeen, back to you.
So that's a good example of that decline on that second lesson.
Mm-hmm.
On the second
that's exactly when it happened. That was when we do the cross-controlled stalls, or this looked like it was a skidded stall. It rolled away from the ball and went around, which gives more time to react. The skid actually goes from that bank to a steeper bank where the slip will go over the top and around. So that's a good building block process to give them more time to see what's going on.
And that, so speaking of cognitive load, and sometimes you wonder whether the stress creates the cognitive load or the cognitive load creates the stress. Sometimes it's hard to say which comes first. But Divya Chandra and a research team looked at cognitive load and states that one reason why added cognitive load can threaten or hinder safety efforts is because of the added stress to the pilot. This is most especially the case since for decades now, automation tends to add cognitive workload when task load is already high, and conversely to reduce cognitive workload when task load is low. When operational complexity is increased, as occurs when operators are required to observe and manage new technologies or phases of flight, anxiety and stress disrupts normal cognitive operations and diminishes human performance. The example of cognitive tunneling being one of the most particularly relevant reactions here. In order to combat complexity-related decreases in performance, we have recommended that pilots develop what they refer to as adaptive expertise. This type of expertise refers to the ability experts have accumulated, whether through training or performance, and apply these learned abilities to new and novel situations for which they have not explicitly prepared. So again, this generalized training for reacting to novel situations is supported by our research community. And we'll look at the next slide. I think we'll take a look at another challenge. And this is for the startle response, or which is also part of the surprise mechanism. Because again, if we look at the model, it shows that if whatever we encountered is above our threshold, we're not going to be able to think and or act in a good way. And we'll take a look at the model again. If we look at the responses on the next section, the training benefits help pilots become more accustomed. And again, it raises that threshold of what is unexpected and is that a fearful situation. And the UPRT, we're going to talk quite a bit about, we should focus on, has these repeated different situations and simulations that have that startle, that onset of this is very different. But then the student learns how to respond to each of those situations and finds out, you know, in the end, well, controlling the airplane is going to be basically the same. We've got a procedure to do that, regardless of what is presented.
Hey,
Go ahead, Otter.
yeah, I just want to ask Janeen, one of the things that we encounter even regularly in this, for instance, we used to teach a recovery strategy of stalls, especially cross control stalls, pressure, power, rudder level climb. So it was kind of a 5-step recovery process, and very comprehensive recovery, and it works very well. However, in the learning stages for a number of pilots, it was too much. It was too much. We had to simplify it just down to 2 steps to be able to get them to overcome some of that fear and cognitive impairment that they would have in that dynamic upset. You know what I'm saying?
Yes.
And now our strategies, we're down to a 4-step strategy, which is much easier to implement, and it's just as comprehensive. But every once in a while, you still encounter somebody that he can't even handle 4 steps throughout it.
And we know it's the push and roll concept, right, Otter, is what you're getting at, right? Just unloading and reorient the lift vector just gets them more into a mental competent state to be able to address those 2 factors.
Mm-hmm. And then using just the first 2 steps works. You can get them to there,
Yes, yes. And in fact, once you get them to see that, hey, let's just do the first two steps, and then we'll reevaluate the status of the airplane and the condition, and then, oh yeah, I see it works, and then you're finally able to add on those additional steps.
And I think we're going to talk here in just a minute about some of the other physiological techniques that can go along with helping with that training to be able to alleviate some of the stress, breathing techniques and where to focus attention and, what to think about. And I know that you teach that. And, for the effective features of the training, I know you can both address this, but from my standpoint, these real world surprise simulations and doing them over and over again, Lanneman and her colleagues have done a lot of research on that. It's the different situations that are presented over and over and over again. And it's also that the instructors know how and when to initiate the startle for the maximum training benefit. Because if they're overwhelmed, we're never going to get anywhere with them, as you have seen over the years. And, and the on-aircraft UPRT, I've got a note on this slide. The high fidelity startle events require resilient UPRT competencies. Now, I rewrote this to say high fidelity startle events create resilient UPRT competencies. It's the repeating it. And if we look at I'm going to back up here, and if you don't mind, I'm going to throw in this definition or this little discussion about resilience. We did a several-year project on resilience, and I just kept scratching my head on, like, what does that word mean to us in this industry? And so what we found out is one of the most critical of response skills to these unanticipated events or these unexpected events is that of resilience. Resilience is considered as a capacity that serves to improve an individual or team's responsibilities so that when they are faced with a novel situation, they are able to react in an effective manner. We also noted that individual human resilience is a set of abilities which can be trained. This was a 3-year-long study, and this is a conclusion from that study. So we know we can train resilience in these in pilots. So while the precise and deterministic response chain in reaction to adverse events, yes, kind of academic words here, cannot be taught due to the proliferation and variability of problems, the skills to cope with such events can be learned. Again, there is a parallel in the motor control literature in which this difference is emphasized between the enactment of specific motor programming versus the activation of more general motor schema. So again, instead of just a rote, do this, this power setting, whatever it is, it's understanding, having that depth of understanding, that self-efficacy that allows the pilots to have that confidence that they're going to control that airplane. And we can go back to your habituation. We now don't have to think about it. We've done it enough that we can, that we're going to handle this situation. Never seen it before, but we're going to handle it.
And I think that, Otter might want to talk about this a little bit, is that we intentionally do that, Janeen, you and I had chatted about that, is that we need to be confident that they have the capabilities to deal with a truly unexpected event they've never seen, that is going to be one that they don't even see coming, even though they're in the program with us. And we don't do that until the last part of the third flight. And that has to be timed properly to the points you have on your slide here, because if you do that too early, it destroys confidence, creates fear. But you do it at the right time, they now gain that confidence, they gain that trust in their skills. That's where the kind of the overlearning process starts. Now they're able to contain that startle surprise, be able to assess the situation, at least get the first step or two underway. To then start gaining situational awareness for further action. Otter, I know that you have a variety of ways of your instructor team to implement that. Did you want to comment on that, the timing of it, and how important it is?
Yeah, and you're exactly right. The instructor has to customize it, be aware of where the student is in that learning process that Janine is talking about, because you can't do it too early there, and it's better to slide it to the right there. But then, and that's the nice thing about the airplane we use, especially the Extra 300, because you truly can create a very sterling, surprising event that they never see coming. That challenges them.
And have not seen before either. It is truly brand new, but if they stick to the fundamental principles, the aerodynamic, sequential process, it essentially diagnoses it back to the heart of the envelope. And that's something where they start gaining confidence in that. One comment on your first one there that we see, unfortunately, and I think anybody who provides UPRT and simulation will see this as well. There's often a strong tendency to try to create a high fidelity startle event in a simulator at the expense of the aero model and the accuracy of the ability of the simulator to replicate the real airplane. And the rationalization is, well, the entire point of this exercise is startle. Well, it is, but you have to balance that with whether or not that event matches up with the correct performance of the simulator in relation to what the airplane would do. And so I would just caution against doing something extremely dramatic in the simulator to generate startle at the expense of fidelity. So Otter, you might want to comment on that. Maybe Janine, you've seen folks trying to do that as well.
Yeah, and this is a problem especially for the airlines in the Part 121 world, the FAA 121 world, that are required to do UPRT extensively, and they're always looking for ways to create this startle. And the instructors, the sim instructors, need to understand you can only take guys so far in a simulator.
Yeah.
There to create that. It's just not really possible to take them where you can in a real airplane.
Now, guys, I'm looking at the time here, and I'm thinking that we might want to continue to say 50, another 8 minutes or so, but I think we're going to get through the human factors section. Maybe before we move on, Janine, there was a couple of videos that we looked at. I think there was one where Otter was working with a major air carrier student back in the simulator, back at the airline, trying to transfer that knowledge from the on-aircraft experience into the simulator. But then there's another one of the high altitude jet upset. Which did you want to? I see the video icon here. Which one would you like to play here?
This is the high altitude jet upset, is it not?
It's available.
Oh, I think that would be. Which I'm going to let that choice up to yours while I put in my 2 cents worth. I know we've got it covered elsewhere, but I'm going to focus on it. There's no training in a ground-based simulator, and I say ground-based because there are in-flight simulators, but there is no substitution for this training in a ground-based simulator. And, my regards to all of the FAA, but the requirement for doing the UPRT in a ground-based simulator, it is not the same thing.
Right.
It is just, and it never will be. And we can go on and on and on about that process, that surprise process. And when we appraise the threat, what is in the simulator? And I've got a little comment later on, BJ, and I don't mean to get too far out of order here, but one of the ways to decrease stress is the whole time you're in the simulator, if you treat it as if you're in the airplane, so that whatever happens in the airplane, you can just say, well, this is just like the simulator. Well, in many cases you can do that, but and the basics of what to do to recover from an upset can be taught in a simulator. Is when it happens in the real world, are we still going to be able to say it's just like the simulator? That's where the problem comes in. So, to all my colleagues out there, I would say to do the on-aircraft training as well. That's not to say there's not a lot that can be learned in a ground-based simulator. Yeah. And in the classroom, there's a lot that can be learned. But just like trying to learn a soft field takeoff and landing by simulating it on a hard surface, you're not going to really have the feel for what's going on until you go do it for real.
And I always say that we either we don't have a dog in a fight or we have a dog in all the fights, because we kind of do it all. We do the academic, we do the on-aircraft piston, on-aircraft jet. We have a convertible simulator to 7 different classes of airplane. We have virtual reality. So we feel that really a robust, effective UPRT program necessarily requires all of it in an integrated way, where the skills transfer from one to the next, and the instructor's role is really to identify the transferable content and mitigate or eliminate the non-transferable items. So I'm going to play this video. It's a high altitude clear air turbulence encounter above 30,000 feet. And this particular pilot is now, I believe, in their 4th flight. And yet it still is a little bit overwhelming because it's just completely different again. And I think that's one of the powers of an effective program like APS. Rarely do we do the same thing over and over again. We want pilots to walk away and say, I trained for that specific scenario at APS. No, at APS, they train me to deal with anything. That's essentially what we're trying to accomplish. So here's just an example of that. But the question I'll leave with Janeen maybe to answer after the video, is it true that the brain actually works differently when you're in the real airplane as opposed to when you're in the simulator? So let's jump into the video right now and she can come back to that.
All right, I will set the autopilot.
Pilot engaged.
So let's say, Mike, you're up
Down.
out here flying on autopilot. Yep. And you're busy doing other things, and you hit some clear air turbulence, okay?
Oh boy.
Stand by and recover.
Push, roll, power.
There you go.
Coming up.
Yeah, you might be fighting autopilot.
Yeah.
Make sure disconnect,
Oh,
one
yeah.
disconnect.
There
Yep.
it is.
There you go.
And
Autopilot off.
So Janeen, your brain, does it work differently in the airplane than the simulator, or are there parallels?
Well, differently, I think it will use, I'm going to go back to that threshold. The threshold as to whether I'm going to go down the surprise pathway of neurological, thinking, or am I going to go a normal thinking path? And because we're in the airplane, that threshold's going to change.
Gotcha.
We know we're in an airplane. The brain knows we're in an airplane. Good question. And but here, from a human factors standpoint, what are we changing here? He's been flying the airplane, been doing the training, been doing the maneuvers, but now we've changed the environment. So that's why, as part of that human factors definition, we have to make sure that we include the impact and the influence of the environment on how the human performs in the system.
All right. Anything else on this slide, Janeen?
Well, this is the sudden unexpected conditions where the FAA emphasizes the importance of this. But again, we're doing primarily specific training events and not generalized training.
Right. In fact, we have a question in there that we'll get to later, I hope, about, is there any part of UPRT where it's not the outcome isn't telegraphed, or that the pilot knows that they're going through an event? Well, the one we talked about, the unexpected wake encounter, this particular one, we kind of sort of saw, but we also have situations that are scenario based, where we'll get a pilot doing a simulation of a circle to land approach and diagnosing the event before it ever departs into the stall, to understand what the precursors or what are the awareness and prevention criteria of overcoming or preventing a skidded turn traffic pattern stall, for example, because it's one of those areas in a skidded turn traffic pattern stall. If it actually departs into the skidded turn stall, there may not be enough time or altitude to miss the ground. There may not be a recovery phase to that process. And so the only way to survive is awareness and prevention and taking early effective action. Otter, do you want to chat to that while I move to the next slide?
Well, let me just add, because I want to talk to the point that what she brought up about the inability of the simulator to create this necessary human factors training related around startle and surprise. And we happen to have online with us one of our part-time instructors, Captain Brad Bennett, who flies for a South African airline, and he worked hard at training 700 of his pilots in UPRT, and he had a crew on an A340 that ended up in an upsat and startled, and had great human factors investigation into the incident. They managed to save the airplane. But I know he would agree with you that they were overwhelmed. They were overwhelmed. But the great thing about the UPRT was once they came out of that startle, they knew what to do. And the human factors expert on the investigation panel directly attributed their UPRT to saving of the airplane there. But it took a while for them to come out of that cognitive impairment from the startle.
It took the third pilot announcing at the top of his voice the strategy, right? Push, roll, power, over and over again till they finally broke out of it and started recognizing, where they were. Kind of, I have been there, seen that now that I've mitigated this, this startle, surprise, this fear, because unfortunately, I say that truly, is that particular crew only had simulator training. They didn't have the benefit of on-aircraft training where they would have learned to mitigate that really overwhelming psychophysiological incapacitation that they experienced. So, that third crew member in that case was really, really critical. Guys, I think this might be our last slide. Janine, if we just consider this the last slide and go to questions, you feel like that would fairly address your section?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. And this can be used as a summary slide. Absolutely. Because in the example you just gave, the stress on those pilots, they had tunnel vision and needed somebody to bring them out of it and get them back on track. The psychological resilience training, I know that, again, we're going to, work on the brain, but we need to work on the brain in the airplane. And the repeated exposure, again, there's tons of research out on that. They just need repeated exposure to different scenarios. It's not like in airline training when everybody knows what the scenario of the year is. And then if you've got your stress levels are too high, if we've already looked at the model, cognitive performance and motor performance both decrease. But that's what's built up through the training. And the stress and anxiety, and those words, stress and anxiety, impaired performance, indicates that the pilot might not be as resilient as they could be. And that's really the purpose of UPRT. And it does wonders for being able to deal with unexpected events.
Excellent. Okay. Anything final thoughts there before we go to questions? Janine, there's 3 of them. Everybody out there, if you have more questions, please add them. Anything on this slide or the slides in general? Janine, are you ready to go and answer a few questions?
I go for the questions.
All right, great, guys. Let me bring in one from Piers. I think this is a really good one because it's directly at Janine. It's going to be a great question. So I'll just read it so you have time to think about it, Janine. It says, I have a student on the flight instructor course who has a debilitating fear of stalls with a wing drop. How can I help him overcome his fear so we can progress to full spin training, which is mandated for the flight instructor assessment of competence?
I don't think this is the real unusual student. And again, I think it's sort of like Otter said earlier, we'll start with just the beginnings and work through the stall series again from the very beginning and make sure that he's confident in recovery, and then take him deeper and show him that he can recover from the wing drop as well and move on to the spin training. But I think the key is if we listen, first lesson, first flight, second flight, third flight, it's going to take a number of flights to get his confidence up to see that, spinning the airplane is not a fearful event and that it's fully controllable and he will have the skills to do it. So I think it's those building blocks that you might want to take a few steps back Again, you also might want to work on some breathing techniques and visualization skills that will help him be able to take his mind off his absolute fear while he's out there in the airplane.
Now, I don't know why I'm looking at it with a quote from Jim Wise. He's the one that wrote Extreme Fear. Again, remember I shared one with you, Janeen? He said, expose yourself to what you are afraid of often enough without harm, then the prefrontal cortex and hippocampus can overwrite the amygdala's fear association. Is that a fair way to look at it? So essentially, you if you're afraid of something, that's what you need to expose yourself to, is essentially, I believe, what he's saying, to the point where you're not, or at least it's
that's desensitization. That's typical psychological desensitization. I can pick up little roaches, and then I can pick up bigger roaches, and then to be real honest, that's what we're training.
Well, I got to put Bill's comment in here because it's more of a statement than anything else. So I'll leave it to you two guys here. So adaptive expertise plus stress inoculation is found in APT or AI, initial stages of military flight training. And Otter, I think you can relate to that for sure.
Absolutely.
Okay, great. Okay, let's go to, we have two more left here, guys, and we have 5 minutes. This is a bit of a longer one. I kind of sort of indirectly addressed it a little bit earlier. Let me just go ahead and read it, then I'll hand it over to you two guys. Here we go. It's from John Power. Does any part of the UPRT course address upsets where a flight control is not providing the anticipated response, or is providing even the opposite response to that's what should be expected? This is one of the big startle surprise events in a very time-constrained situation. For example, left rudder pedal depressed, but due to a flight control failure, the effective right rudder, such as US Air 427. And thanks, as always, great presentation. So I think that's, we're almost looking at alternative control strategies here, Otter. Did you want to talk to that a little bit, then get Janeen to jump in?
Yeah, we feel it's a very important part of a comprehensive UPRT program. There it is that it presents some very unique challenges, and especially from a physiological standpoint for most pilots, especially if you're dealing with jammed or deflected, especially fully deflected flight controls, like a fully deflected rudder, that kind of thing. It's very abnormal, very disconcerting to pilots, especially in a real airplane. It's one thing to do it in a simulator where you have literally almost no physiological, feeling related to it and all that. But to do it in a real airplane is very eye-opening. And I see that most pilots, when they finish our alternate control strategies portion of the training, wow, their competence or their confidence really goes way up.
And then understanding things like crossover speed as well, Otter. Understanding aerodynamically that there's just places where you can be, that it doesn't matter who you are. The aerodynamics will simply not let you recover that airplane. And so I think that understanding is really, really important as well. So great job. Janeen, anything to add to that?
That's exactly what I was going to say. I was going to say, use the example of crossover speed. Exactly.
I need to stop talking. Sorry about that. No, great. Okay, here's one from Gene. Remember Gene, Otter. How successful has VR been as a development tool to support the process of experiencing UPRT, understanding the gold standard is actually flight operations? Now, Otter had the unique experience of getting fully immersed into VR training at BASE, the Business Aviation Conference, whatever that used to be, MBAA event. But how many people did you train there, Otter, at Las Vegas in VR? You did a ton of them, right? But anyway, do you want to talk to Gene about this, about the role of VR?
Yeah, it's been a very surprising tool that, I'll be honest, I wasn't too enthusiastic about in the beginning, but as we did employ it, as we began to really try to figure out how to use all of its aspects in the development of pilots' understanding, we found numerous areas that it was very beneficial there. And especially, not only are you doing this environmental transfer where you're now putting the pilots in their own airplane, their type-specific airplane. So if they're Challenger pilots, you can put them in a Challenger cockpit. But now you can take them outside of the Challenger as well there, and they get to see lift lines and things like that frankly, they hadn't thought about there. So we feel it's been very beneficial.
Absolutely. And I think the whole point of that, Gene, is the fact that the VR offers one more step towards the been there, seen that in their airplane and their environment. So the academic training prepares them theoretically. The on-aircraft piston training addresses many of the human factors to give them a discipline in crisis. The transfer from VR visual environment into the instrument environment to instrument recovery goes from VMC to IMC, then from piston into jet, low altitude jet, from simple to complex, and then from low to high altitude, then back into a side-by-side simulator, again with the transfer of skill to make it much more like their environment, with the representative control response and feel, ideally with one of their very own crew members with them if they're coming as a crew, and then wrapping it up to Otter's point in the VR where they leave and it's like, hey, not only do I have a new skill when it comes to human factors and some resilience in crisis, I've actually seen it in my own environment. And I've worked with one of my team doing it as well, because very often UPRT is taught as single pilot, but in a crewed operation, it's addressed as a crew. And it's really important that they get that part of their program as well. So anything else, Janeen, to add to that, or what did we miss on that?
No, I think the integration is the key.
Awesome.
Thanks for that question, Gene. It's good to see you.
Absolutely. Yeah. Gene's a real champion of effective training. That's for sure. Okay, guys, with that, first and foremost, Janeen, huge thank you to you for spending all this time preparing and working with us over the years and being here at this event. I'm just glad we got to focus on the human factor component for it. Maybe before I go to thanking everybody for being out there with us, any final words of wisdom or wrap-up comments you'd like to share with everybody?
From my experience as a designated pilot examiner, I am going to continue to champion the idea of UPRT for everyone, starting at the initial licensing level all the way through recurrent, including myself, to be out there.
Well, you have a standing invitation, right, Janeen? Otter, thank you for being here. And everybody, thank you for being out there. If you like what you saw today, please give us a thumbs up. That helps us get these videos out to more pilots, because we're here to help every pilot bring everyone home safely. So that's our role. That's our job. Guys, thank you so much. Thanks, everybody. Bye-bye.
Night.